The storm hit Belhaven before midnight, burying every road and silencing every streetlight along the mountain corridor. Through the white and the wind came Caleb Rowan, coat glazed with ice, boots soaked through, arms wrapped around a massive white dog that did not belong to him. He had walked 2 miles through the blizzard to return the animal to the estate of Vivienne Ashcroft, the billionaire whose company had once taken everything from him. When Vivienne opened the door of her limousine and told her driver to bring Caleb home, he looked at the Ashcroft crest, stamped in silver on the door panel, and said, simply, "I'll walk." But she had no idea that the man turning his back on her in that storm was carrying a secret that could save her empire from a disaster already closing in. If you believe in quiet men who don't bend, stay with this story, because what Vivienne Ashcroft learns about pride will cost her far more than she ever expected. Belhaven, Colorado sat at 4,000 feet above sea level, ringed by peaks that funneled wine down into the valley with a kind of institutional cruelty, and in early January the town did not merely experience winter, it submitted to it. The blizzard that arrived on a Tuesday had been forecast for 3 days, and by the time it descended, the county had already closed the 2 main passes and issued a shelter-in-place advisory for the mountain districts north of the highway. Most people in Belhaven understood this and stayed inside, and most sensible things did the same. Caleb Rowan had never been accused of excessive sensibility when it came to his own comfort, and so he had spent the afternoon making the rounds between a broken fuel line on a snowplow and a generator at the county rescue station that had developed a fault in its transfer switch. He fixed the generator without charging for the labor because he knew the rescue station ran on a county budget that had been cut twice in 3 years. And because he did not like the idea of someone calling for help on a night like this and hearing nothing but static on the other end of the radio. He was driving back toward his shop on the east side of town when the pickup died. The fuel line, exposed along an undercarriage section he had been meaning to replace since October, had finally frozen solid, and the engine coughed twice and quit on a stretch of access road that ran along the northern forest edge. Caleb climbed out into the dark, assessed the situation with the kind of detached efficiency that had always made his coworkers slightly uncomfortable, and determined that the truck was not going anywhere that night without heat and a wrench he did not have on him. He had started walking toward the nearest shelter marker when he heard something moving in the snow near the tree line, a low, persistent sound, rhythmic and exhausted, unlike the wind. The dog was white, which was the only reason Caleb saw it at all. A Great Pyrenees the size of a small pony had tangled its leash in the lower strand of a split-rail fence, and the animal had been working at the knot long enough that the snow had built up across its back in a thick, even layer, giving it the appearance of something half-buried and barely alive. Caleb dropped to one knee, unclipped the leash from the fence post with bare hands that had already gone numb at the fingertips, and checked the dog's legs for injury while it turned its enormous head and looked at him with the patience of something that had decided to trust him entirely and without reservation. The collar was heavy leather with a brushed silver clasp, and stamped into the clasp was a stylized letter A inside a mountain silhouette. A mark Caleb recognized without pleasure from a decade of engineering reports and letterheads, and, finally, the termination paperwork he had signed under duress in a glass-walled conference room 7 years ago. He knew who this dog was. He had seen the animal in photographs accompanying profiles of Vivienne Ashcroft, always seated beside her at some charity event or board function, a deliberate symbol of approachability in the image of a woman otherwise described as cold by every journalist who had ever interviewed her. The Ashcroft estate was nearly 2 miles away, through terrain that was rapidly becoming impassable, and his phone had gone dead somewhere between the rescue station and the tree line. He could take the dog to his shop, which was closer, but the animal kept pulling northeast toward the estate, straining with a single-mindedness that told him it knew exactly where home was. Caleb looked down the road that disappeared into the dark, thought briefly about the last time the name Ashcroft had appeared in his life, and then removed his outer jacket and wrapped it around the dog's back and shoulders. He did not let himself think too long about what he was doing. He started walking. The memory came without invitation, the way it always did when he was cold and alone and moving through dark. The glass lobby of Ashcroft's headquarters building in Denver, the cardboard box in his arms, the ring of faces at the mezzanine railing, watching him cross the floor toward the exit. Not with pity, but with the particular satisfaction of men who had been told that the inconvenient voice in the room had finally been silenced. He had warned them, in writing and in person, that the material substitutions being made in the mountain infrastructure contracts would create pressure failure conditions that no inspector would catch until something went very wrong in the cold. They had thanked him for his concern and then handed his analysis to a junior attorney who made it disappear. Caleb had crossed that lobby without speaking, pushed through the revolving door, and had not looked back. He was still not looking back now, even as he walked toward the house that bore that name. Because the dog in his arms was shivering, the dog had done nothing wrong, and that was the only calculation that mattered tonight. Through the trees he could see the lights of the Ashcroft estate, warm yellow behind tall windows, a long gravel drive lit by carriage lamps buried to their caps in snow. From somewhere behind the gate, a radio crackled, and he could make out 2 figures in dark coats moving along the fence line with flashlights, clearly searching for something. They had not yet seen him. He adjusted the dog in his arms, kept walking toward the light, and did not know that those figures had been given a description. A man who might have taken the dog, someone to be stopped at the perimeter and held until the proper authorities arrived. The 2 security guards at the gate reached Caleb before he reached the intercom, and the way they moved, flanking, hands near their radios, told him they had not come to thank him. They swept their flashlights across his face and down to the dog and back up again, taking inventory of the torn hem of his jacket, the ice in his beard, the boots held together at one toe with electrical tape he had applied that morning and forgotten about. One of the guards said, "Sir, you need to step back from the gate," with the particular inflection of someone who had already decided what kind of person he was looking at. Caleb said he had found the dog tangled in a fence off the forest road about 2 miles north, and that he was returning it. The guard did not write this down. The second guard had already gotten on his radio, and within 90 seconds the estate's head of household staff, a trim man in his late 50s named Garrett who wore his coat like a uniform, had come through the pedestrian gate and was staring at Caleb with an expression that balanced official courtesy against obvious suspicion. Garrett explained that the dog had been reported missing for several hours, that the estate had been concerned, and that given the dog's value, the family appreciated any assistance, but that it would be necessary for Caleb to remain outside the gate while they verified the animal's condition. The phrasing was careful, but the meaning was plain. He was being kept at arm's length until they could determine what he wanted. Caleb set Atlas carefully on the ground and stepped back 2 paces, saying nothing, because he had learned a long time ago that explaining yourself to people who had already reached a verdict was an exercise in self-deception. Preston Voss emerged from the front entrance of the main house while Garrett was still speaking, moving down the drive with the unhurried confidence of a man who owned his portion of every room he entered. Preston was 49, silver-templed and broad-shouldered, the kind of man whose tailoring cost more than Caleb earned in a month of ordinary work. He recognized Caleb within a few feet of the gate, and his expression shifted from general authority into something colder and more specific. He called Caleb by name, loudly enough that the guards could hear, and added, "The man who used to work in heating systems before he developed legal problems." He told the guards that a person like Caleb Rowan did not turn up at the Ashcroft estate in the middle of a blizzard out of simple goodwill, that in his experience men in these circumstances were usually building towards something, a demand, a story they wanted to sell, a claim they were about to make. He said it pleasantly, in the tone of a man explaining an obvious thing to an audience he expected to agree with him. Caleb asked them to check the dog's paws for cold injury and to pull the GPS history from the collar before anyone drew further conclusions. Preston laughed at this and said he was not sure a man who repaired space heaters in a mountain town had the standing to make diagnostic requests at someone else's property. Then Atlas, who had been standing quietly beside the guard's leg, broke free with a sudden lurch of muscle and crossed the 10 feet of space between the gate and Caleb in a straight line, pressing its massive head against Caleb's hip and standing there with a stillness that looked like a verdict. The guards looked at each other. Garrett looked at the dog. Preston's jaw tightened by a fraction. Vivienne Ashcroft appeared at the gate a moment later, pulling a coat over her shoulders, and stopped when she saw Atlas. The relief moved across her face so quickly that it was almost invisible to someone not watching closely, but Caleb was watching, and he saw it, and then he watched her reassemble the professional stillness she wore like a second skin. She looked at Caleb and asked how much he wanted, because that was the frame through which she understood all transactions between people who had what she needed and people who did not. She was not being cruel. She was simply using the only language the world around her had ever required her to learn. Preston leaned close to Vivienne and murmured something Caleb could not hear. Whatever it was, it made her expression firm. She reached into her coat and produced a folded envelope. Caleb looked at it and shook his head. She named a larger figure. He shook his head again. She said quietly, and with what she intended as pragmatic sympathy, that there was no reason to make this complicated, that he had done a good thing and deserved to be compensated, and that there was no shame in that. Preston said, "Don't mistake one rare act of decency for a ticket into a world that isn't yours." Caleb looked at Preston without heat and said, "I'm not trying to get into your world. I just wanted the dog home." Vivienne instructed her driver to prepare the car. The way she delivered the instruction had the cadence of an order rather than a courtesy, as though the obligation being discharged was the closing of a ledger entry rather than the acknowledgement of something freely given. The limousine sat idling in the circular drive, a long black vehicle whose engine made almost no sound in the cold, and the driver, following Vivienne's instruction without enthusiasm, had gotten out and opened the rear door and placed a folded blanket across the seat, gesturing at Caleb's wet clothes in a way that made the gesture feel less like courtesy and more like pest management. Caleb looked at the car. He looked at the embossed Ashcroft crest on the rear door panel, that stylized A inside the mountain, rendered in silver on black, and for a moment he was somewhere else entirely. Standing in a parking garage in Denver, while two men in security uniforms watched him load a cardboard box into the back seat of a rideshare, because his employee badge had already been deactivated and he could not go back into the building to retrieve his own laptop. That had been the last time he had been inside anything carrying that logo. He had not been invited. He had been delivered. He stepped back from the open door. Vivienne had followed him out to the drive, Atlas at her side, and she watched him with the particular alertness of someone accustomed to controlling the outcomes of situations who was noticing, with something between irritation and genuine curiosity, that this one was not resolving itself the way she expected. She held out the envelope again. Caleb told her that self-respect was not a performance, set the envelope on the hood of the limousine without taking it, and retrieved the canvas work tarp he had used to wrap Atlas during the walk. He handed the tarp to the nearest guard, who accepted it with the baffled expression of someone who had expected a negotiation and received instead a receipt for nothing. Vivian asked why he would not get into the car when the temperature outside was well below zero and still falling. It was a reasonable question posed without gentleness, because she was a woman who had learned that gentleness in professional conversations was usually a prelude to being taken advantage of. Caleb looked at her directly and said, "The last time I got into a vehicle with that logo on the door, your people were driving me out of my own building after taking everything I built. Tonight, I'll walk." Vivienne said nothing for a moment. Then she said his name, his full name, Caleb Rowan, with a flicker of something that was not quite recognition and not quite guilt, but existed somewhere between them. The way a sound heard through a wall carries shape without clarity. Preston was immediately at her shoulder, smooth and preemptive, explaining that Caleb had been dismissed from Ashcroft's engineering division for data falsification, that he had attempted to delay a $2 billion infrastructure project with unfounded objections, and that the termination had been thoroughly documented and legally clean. He said it with the confidence of someone who had arranged that documentation himself and trusted it completely. Caleb did not contest any of it. He turned to leave, and as he did, he paused briefly and looked through the gate at the guard station, where a site plan for Blackridge Crown, Ashcroft's Showcase Mountain Resort, scheduled to open in under a week, was pinned to the wall beneath a floodlight. He studied it for a few seconds in the way an engineer studies a familiar problem from across a room, and then said, without raising his voice, "You've sealed the northern pressure relief corridor. When the temperature swings back up, the ice under that foundation isn't going to be the most dangerous thing." Preston laughed. He called it dramatic and said that the county had already signed off on every modification. One of the younger engineers standing near the guard station, a man named Nolan Pierce, who had joined the Blackridge project 18 months ago, looked up from his clipboard, and the color left his face in a way that no one else in the group noticed. Caleb noticed, kept walking, and let the dark and the snow close around him, while Atlas stood inside the gate watching until he had fully disappeared. The morning after the blizzard, Vivian summoned the Blackridge Crown engineering team to a conference room in the estate's administrative wing and asked about the northern pressure relief corridor with the directness of someone who had not slept and did not intend to waste time on preamble. Preston sat at the far end of the table and explained, as he had explained before, that the corridor had been removed from the final design because the original specification was over-engineered, expensive, and ultimately redundant given modern sensor placement. He cited 3 reports prepared by subcontractors, referenced a pair of consulting firms, and produced a summary document bearing the stamps of 2 county inspectors. The table, for the most part, nodded. Nolan Pierce did not nod. He sat at the side of the table with his hands flat on the surface, and when Vivienne looked at him and asked directly whether the original design had specified a thermal exhaust corridor for the north section, he said yes, clearly and without elaboration. She asked why it had been removed. He said his direct supervisor had instructed him to revise the load tolerance report to reflect the modified design, and that when he had raised concerns, he was told the project was already past its budget threshold and that his job was to document the approved design, not to relitigate decisions made by people above his pay grade. Vivienne looked at the revised report, then at the original, then asked whose name appeared as lead systems designer on the foundational specification. Nolan turned his laptop so she could see the screen. The name read, Caleb Rowan, P.E., Senior Infrastructure Engineer, Ashcroft Alpine Division. She sat with that for a moment. Then she called her driver, went to find the man whose name she had signed off on terminating 7 years ago. The shop that bore the name Rowan Winter Repair sat on a half-acre lot on the east side of Belhaven, in a metal building that had originally served as a farm equipment storage facility and still smelled faintly of machine oil and dry grass beneath the heavier scents of antifreeze and welding flux. Vivienne arrived to find a notice of land acquisition taped to the front door, a document her legal department had prepared and dispatched 2 weeks earlier as part of the corridor expansion for the resort service road. She had not reviewed this particular parcel herself. She stepped inside and found Caleb beneath the engine compartment of a snowplow with 2 wrenches and his full attention, listening to a weather forecast on the radio with the remote composure of someone who had already factored the information into his morning and moved on. The walls of the shop were the detail that recalibrated her. Between the tool racks and the parts shelves, mounted in simple frames without ceremony, were a structural engineering license renewed through the current year, 4 patents granted between a decade ago and 5 years prior, a photograph of Caleb accepting a regional engineering award from a federal agency, and a letter of commendation from the Army Corps of Engineers for work done on mountain infrastructure across 2 western states. She had been briefed that she was visiting a displaced tradesman who was causing friction. She was looking at the credentials of someone who had never stopped being an engineer. She told him the acquisition notice was not personal and was part of an approved expansion plan. He slid out from under the plow, stood, and wiped his hands, and said that he understood it was not personal, which was precisely the problem, that the livelihoods being displaced rarely were. She asked about the original design documents. He said the files from his time at Ashcroft were the company's intellectual property, and she was welcome to petition for them through proper legal channels, but that a company could not in the same breath declare his engineering judgment worthless and then arrive at his shop to borrow it. Preston appeared at the door 40 minutes later with 2 attorneys and a land surveyor, holding the acquisition timeline like a verdict, and called Rowan Winter Repair, a pile of scrap iron blocking the path to progress, loudly enough for 3 neighbors who had gathered outside to hear every word. Before anyone had finished responding, a pipe at Blackridge Crown's northern utility junction burst under ice pressure. and the heating grid for the entire north wing went offline. The Blackridge Crown opening was 3 days away. 47 journalists had confirmed attendance. 11 institutional investors representing a combined portfolio of roughly $9 billion had accepted invitations. The resort's north wing contained 12 of the 32 premier suites, 2 of the 4 signature dining areas, and the centerpiece of the entire property, a glass and timber observation lounge cantilevered over a mountain ridge at an elevation that the marketing materials described as transcendent. The heating failure in the north grid was, in Preston's framing, a temporary mechanical inconvenience that would be remedied before anyone of consequence arrived. He dispatched a crew with portable units and instructed the site manager to keep all perimeter staff away from the north entrance until the systems were stable again. The engineers on the ground were less reassured. Ground-level sensors at the base of the North Foundation cluster were registering upward pressure anomalies consistent with subsurface water migration, a phenomenon that occurred when freeze-thaw cycles created internal movement beneath a sealed foundation without adequate drainage pathways. The pattern was technically preliminary and required confirmation across multiple sensor cycles, but it was familiar to anyone who had spent time doing mountain structural work, and 2 engineers who had been with the project since its early phases both knew, without having to say it directly, that the pattern was familiar because they had seen it described in a risk assessment that had been quietly removed from the official file. Vivian drove to Rowan Winter Repair alone, without Preston, without her assistant, without the car that bore the Ashcroft crest. She arrived in a plain sedan and sat across the workbench from Caleb and named a figure for his consultation that reflected how seriously she was now taking the situation. Caleb told her the number was not the issue. He said she was asking him to stabilize a structure that had failed because someone in her organization had buried his original warnings, and that he was not prepared to lend his expertise to a company that had not yet acknowledged the first time it had asked him to save something it had already broken. Vivian said she had hundreds of employees whose livelihoods depended on that resort opening, that the burden of what had gone wrong was not theirs to bear, and that she was asking him to separate his legitimate grievance from the immediate problem in front of them. He sat with that for a long moment, and then said he would look at the data because of the workers, not because of Ashcroft, and that she should understand the difference. What he found in the sensor logs confirmed everything he had written in his original assessment 7 years before. The pressure relief corridor had not been decommissioned. It had been filled in to accommodate additional square footage of spa construction that added a 19% return premium to the north wing's projected revenue. The thermal expansion sensors had been repositioned in a way that created a dead zone of approximately 400 square feet directly above the load-bearing foundation of the observation lounge. The drainage equations in the revised design assumed a soil composition that the actual site geology did not match. He told Vivian the North Foundation was sitting on a pressure envelope that would destabilize when the temperature shifted, and that based on the rate of change in the current sensor readings, that shift was within 48 hours. Preston arrived. He had been told about the consultation and came prepared with a printed copy of Caleb's termination file and a letter from a structural engineering firm in Denver that had reviewed the Blackridge design and certified it without objection. He announced that Caleb Rowan had been dismissed for falsifying load data, that the original design had contained errors the revised specification had actually corrected, and that a disgruntled former employee's assessment of a project he had not touched in 7 years carried exactly the weight it deserved. Several of Caleb's regular customers, standing in the parking area outside, set their appointment cards on the front counter and quietly left without making eye contact. Vivienne did not defend Caleb. She asked him to produce documented evidence to support his analysis before she took further action. Caleb looked at her for a moment, then said she was entitled to make that demand, and that he understood it, and that she should understand in return that if she waited for his documentation to move through her legal process, it would not arrive in time. He left without another word. On his way out, he paused at the door and asked whether anyone had pulled the GPS history from Atlas's collar, specifically the data from the night the dog had gone missing, because the route the animal had taken suggested it had accessed a space that was not supposed to exist. No one answered. Preston, returning to the estate after the meeting, accessed the collar's management platform on his phone, but before his car had cleared the end of the block. Marlo Quinn had been Ashcroft Alpine Holdings' head of legal affairs for 9 years, and she had developed, over those 9 years, a specific professional sensitivity to the sound of someone trying to quietly close a door. The request to purge the GPS archive on Atlas's tracking collar came through the system flagged as routine data management, but it originated from Preston Voss's administrative account at 11:47 in the evening, 2 hours after the consultation at Caleb's shop. And Marlo had a personal policy, unofficial, accumulated through experience. That routine data management did not happen at midnight from a senior executive's account. She backed up the archive to an isolated drive before the deletion completed and sent Vivienne a single message. "You need to see the collar data before it's gone. I already have a copy." The path Atlas had taken on the night of the blizzard was not the path of a dog that had slipped through a carelessly opened gate. The GPS trace showed a route from the estate service perimeter through a northern maintenance corridor that Preston had described to the county inspector as fully sealed. A corridor that, according to the Blackridge Crown official documentation, no longer existed. Atlas had entered the resort's northern utility substructure through an access panel that the construction records listed as welded shut, had moved through approximately 60 feet of internal passage, and had exited through an emergency egress point on the far side of the facility's foundation wall before continuing northeast toward the tree line where Caleb had found it. Vivienne called Caleb that night and told him what Marlo had found. He was quiet for a moment, and then said that the corridor existed because it had been his design, and that when a structure is built over an existing thermal passage without properly sealing or redirecting it, the passage does not disappear. It becomes an unmonitored pressure channel. He said Atlas had followed the heat because a warm underground passage in the middle of a blizzard was exactly where a large cold animal would go if it found an opening. The fact that Atlas could enter and traverse that passage meant the sealed corridor was neither sealed nor decommissioned. It was a live thermal conduit running directly beneath the north foundation of the observation lounge, generating upward heat pressure into the soil for 2 years straight. The ice above it was not frozen solid as the foundation design assumed. It was cycling. Marlo had also been working through the email archive on the Blackridge project files, and what she found there was not subtle. Preston had exchanged a series of messages with the lead subcontractor, over a period of 4 months in which Caleb's original thermal management system had been reclassified as unnecessary infrastructure. The thermal corridor had been redesignated as a decommissioned utility channel, and the cost savings from eliminating it had been quietly reallocated to accelerate the project timeline so that Preston's performance bonus, tied to an on-time opening, would be maximized. The reports attributed the design changes to an internal review panel. The internal review panel had never met. Caleb's safety flags had been removed from the active file and transferred to a supplemental archive labeled Superseded Recommendations. Vivienne sat in her office at 2 in the morning with the email chain and the GPS trace and the original engineering file side by side, and understood that she had signed a termination order based on a summary document Preston Voss had prepared, and that she had never read the underlying materials. She drove to the shop the next morning and found Caleb doing inventory and told him she understood what had happened and that she was sorry. Caleb looked at her and said that a private apology did not correct a public destruction, that the people in that conference room 7 years ago had watched him walk out carrying a box, and that what had been done to his name in front of witnesses required witnesses to set it right. He said, "You didn't build the lie, Vivienne, but you gave it an office, a title, and the authority to destroy anyone standing in its way." He told her to cancel the opening, evacuate the north section, and disclose the structural findings to the county. Vivienne said that an emergency disclosure would collapse the company's share price and potentially end her tenure as CEO. Caleb said that hesitation was the very reason a man like Preston had survived as long as he had, and then he walked back into the shop and let her stand outside with that thought. He had not finished speaking before her phone buzzed with a message from the resort's site manager. 40 investors had arrived at Blackridge Crown a full day early because the weather window for the mountain road was closing and they had moved their travel forward. The emergency session convened in the resort's main conference facility at 4 in the afternoon, pulling together 11 members of the Ashcroft board, 6 county officials, the project's engineering leads, 4 investor representatives, and 2 reporters who had arrived early and technically could not be excluded without creating problems worse than their presence. Preston had arranged the room. He had also arranged Caleb's credentials card at the table, and the card read, "Caleb Rowan, local contractor." The slight was precise and deliberate and visible to everyone present. Caleb looked at it, set it face down without a word, and opened the folder he had brought. Preston opened the session by establishing the narrative. A former disgruntled employee, terminated for cause, had reappeared during a moment of institutional vulnerability to leverage a vague structural allegation against a real estate asset he wanted to prevent from being developed because the development threatened a property he occupied. He presented the termination file, the revised engineering reports, the county sign-off documents, and a letter from the consulting firm certifying the North Wing's structural compliance. He delivered all of it with the authority of a man who had spent 7 years ensuring that every document in the official file pointed in the same direction. A senior board member laughed audibly when Caleb unrolled a set of hand-drawn site plans and placed them on the presentation table next to Preston's printed binders and slide deck. Caleb did not respond to the laughter. He asked the room to display the 48-hour temperature projection for the mountain district on the monitor. When it appeared, he pointed to 3 specific indicators in the forecast and made 3 specific predictions. First, that the pressure differential in the north building's utility conduit would produce measurable oscillation in the eastern pipe manifold within 30 minutes. Second, that the glass panel array in the north observation lounge would exhibit low-frequency lateral vibration as subsurface pressure migrated toward the foundation perimeter. Third, that the pump room in the north mechanical bay would show discoloration in its floor drain, consistent with upward water migration from the soil layer beneath the slab. Preston called these guesses. He said that vague predictions could be made to look like insight after the fact, and that this was a classic technique of someone trying to manufacture credibility before an audience. Caleb folded his hands on the table and watched the clock. The pipe manifold oscillation began at 17 minutes. The glass panel vibration was detectable by the third row of observers at 22 minutes. The pump room drain showed discolored water at 26 minutes. The room did not laugh after that. A county engineer at the side of the table pushed back his chair and stood. The investor representatives began speaking to each other in quiet, urgent voices. Caleb laid the original design specifications on the table, the full set, not the summary document, signed by himself and countersigned by 2 independent certification bodies, and pointed to the section establishing the thermal corridor, the pressure relief pathway, and the drainage envelope the revised design had eliminated. He said that this system was the foundation on which Black Ridge Crown's building permits had been issued, because the county approval was conditioned on the thermal management specifications, and those specifications bore his name. Nolan Pierce took a breath the entire room could hear, and said clearly, and for the record, that Preston Voss had instructed him to revise the load tolerance reports, that the instruction had come with a direct threat to his continued employment, and that he had complied under duress and had regretted it every day since. Preston's response was to assert that Caleb had no procedural authority in an Ashcroft proceeding. Caleb said he did not need Ashcroft's authority. The county safety office had received his full technical assessment by electronic submission at 8 o'clock that morning. The door opened and 2 representatives from the county building authority stepped inside and announced that the north section of Black Ridge Crown was being placed under an emergency occupancy hold, pending independent structural review, effective immediately. A sensor on the monitoring panel at the end of the room switched from amber to red. Caleb looked at it and understood before anyone else had processed what the color meant, that the order had arrived approximately 4 hours later than the situation required. There was no chaos in the room. Caleb did not allow it. He stood at the head of the table and assigned 3 engineers by name to specific mechanical checkpoints before the room had fully absorbed what the red sensor meant, his voice carrying the clean authority of someone who had designed the system they were now trying to save. He sent 2 others to the North Corridor access points with explicit instructions. No manual intervention on the primary drain valves without his direct instruction, because opening them in the wrong sequence would accelerate the pressure migration rather than redirect it. Preston said loudly that this was still an Ashcroft facility and that no one was taking operational direction from a man who had arrived at their gate in a snowstorm holding a dog. Vivienne looked at Preston for exactly 3 seconds, then looked at the room and told the engineering team to follow Caleb's instructions. The precision of those 3 seconds communicated everything that needed to be communicated about where the operational authority in the room had just been transferred. Caleb descended to the northern mechanical corridor with a 2-person team. The system he had designed a decade ago was mostly intact beneath the modifications. The valves were where he had placed them. The access panels were where he had specified. The pressure relief architecture was legible to him in the way a handwriting sample is legible to its author. He needed 3 valves opened in sequence, beginning with the eastern bypass and ending with the foundation drain at the base of the north wall. The first 2 opened without incident. The third was locked behind a software access protocol that required administrative credentials, and when the team attempted to reach Preston for the access code, Preston responded through the radio that he did not remember the exact credential string and would need to locate it. And he said this in the tone of a man who remembered it perfectly and had reasons not to share it. Marlowe had anticipated this. She had been monitoring Preston's system access remotely since the previous evening, and she sent Vivienne a file in real time showing that Preston had logged into the valve control system 12 minutes prior and manually locked the third valve, not because of a forgotten password, but because the pump room beneath it contained 2 servers whose drive contents he did not want reviewed by anyone about to be given full site access. Vivienne signed a remote authorization stripping Preston of all system privileges from her phone, standing in the main corridor with her coat over her arm and her jaw set. Preston was escorted from the building by 2 county officials who had been waiting for exactly this kind of development to make their involvement necessary. It was Atlas who found the final access point. Vivienne had brought the dog to the site that afternoon, partly because Atlas's presence reduced tension in high-stress situations, and partly because she found the animal steadying when she was making decisions she could not take back. Atlas had been circling a section of decorative wall paneling in the north corridor for 15 minutes, nosing at the baseboard with the persistence of something that remembered. Caleb checked the GPS trace against the physical layout and realized the location matched the path Atlas had taken on the night of the blizzard, the route through the thermal corridor that was not supposed to exist. He put his hand against the wall panel, felt vibration behind it, and found the seam where the paneling had been applied over a utility door that the finishing crew had covered without marking on any updated schematic. They removed the paneling and found the manual bypass valve from Caleb's foundational design behind it. Never removed, never properly sealed, simply hidden beneath a layer of decorative material, he opened it by hand. The pressure reading on the monitor dropped by 22% in the first 4 minutes, continued falling at a controlled rate, and the sensor on the emergency panel shifted from red back to amber, and then, 11 minutes later, to green. When the site manager confirmed that the foundation readings had stabilized, the room that had gathered around the monitoring station was quiet for a moment, with the specific quality of silence that follows the moment when a terrible thing is shown to have been survivable. Vivienne told the assembled press before anyone had crafted a statement. Caleb Rowan warned this company about a structural failure that would have injured people, and this company silenced him and damaged his reputation. He was right, and we were wrong, and those are not corrections that money can fully address. The land acquisition notice for Rowan Winter Repair was rescinded 4 days later in writing, with a letter signed by Vivienne acknowledging that the legal process had been initiated through a falsified project timeline and that the company was withdrawing its claim with prejudice. The financial damages Caleb had sustained since his termination, lost contracts, lost licensing revenue from patents that had been assigned to Ashcroft as a condition of employment and then monetized without his knowledge, were calculated by an independent auditor. His professional record was formally restored, and Ashcroft's legal team was instructed to contact every firm that had received the blacklist notification and issue a written correction describing the original termination as based on fabricated evidence. The board expected Caleb to accept the vice presidency of technical operations because it was a significant title attached to a significant compensation package and because, from where the board sat, the arithmetic was obvious. Caleb sat across the conference table from 12 people who had never doubted their ability to absorb talented individuals into the structures that served them, and he declined the position without apology. Vivian asked what he wanted. He told her there were 4 things and said them without drama or embellishment. He wanted an independent technical safety board with authority to halt any Ashcroft project that failed its review, populated by engineers who did not report to the corporate hierarchy. He wanted formal whistleblower protection codified into the company's employment agreements, with binding provisions and external oversight. He wanted the company's land acquisition policy revised so that no residential or commercial parcel could be taken without a negotiated agreement with the affected parties, reviewed by independent counsel. And he wanted a portion of the Blackridge Crown facility converted into a vocational training center for construction and engineering trades, named not for a donor or a family, but for the category of workers who had built the thing in the first place. He did not ask for anything with his own name on it. The board member who had laughed at the hand-drawn plans sat very still. Vivian accepted all 4 conditions. She additionally asked whether Caleb would serve as an independent technical advisor to the company, with the right to review any project above a certain scale, and the contractual right to escalate findings directly to the board without passing through the executive chain. He said he would consider it if the advisor agreement contained a provision allowing him to withdraw from any project he judged to be proceeding unsafely, without penalty and without review. She said it would. He said he would read the agreement and that, if it said what she claimed it said, he would sign it. He did not say he forgave her. She did not ask him to. She stood in front of the assembled workers, county officials, and journalists outside the resort that afternoon and said, without notes and without her communications team present, Caleb Rowan warned this company about a structural failure that would have injured people and destroyed property, and this company silenced him, damaged his reputation, and pursued his land. He was right, and we were wrong, and those are not corrections that money can fully address. She used his full name. She did not use the word oversight or process failure, or any of the language that organizations employ when they want to acknowledge a problem without acknowledging the people who caused it. Caleb's daughter Sadie drove back from college that weekend, not because he had told her anything was wrong, but because she had seen the news and understood that her father had done something significant and had not called to tell her, which meant it had cost him something. She found him in the shop doing ordinary work on an ordinary machine, and she stayed through Sunday and told him she was not surprised and did not need him to explain. Vivian began coming to the shop without her security detail in the weeks that followed, asking questions before she issued instructions and staying longer each time. Blackridge Crown reopened 6 weeks later after a full independent structural review had certified every system against the original specifications, including the thermal corridor, reinstated and documented, designated on the official schematic for the first time as the Rowan Pressure Relief System. The north wing opened with 20% fewer suites than originally planned, because the square footage previously occupied by the spa that had displaced the drainage envelope was now a workshop and classroom facility for the county's technical apprenticeship program. The center was named for the trades, and its first cohort of students included 4 workers who had been employed on the original Black Ridge construction crew and had been told for 2 years that the changes to the design were above their pay grade to question. Caleb kept the shop. He still drove out on cold mornings to fix generators for people who could not afford the resort's service rates, still answered calls from the county rescue station, still charged what the work was worth, and not a dollar more. His name now appeared on the masthead of an independent safety board reviewing engineering documentation for 3 major projects across 2 states, and he attended those reviews in the same work boots he wore to repair snowplow transmissions, because the boots were good boots and the work was the same work. Vivian had replaced most of the executive team in the months following Preston's removal. Preston himself was facing a state-level fraud investigation and had retained attorneys rather than advisors, and she had restructured the reporting hierarchy so that technical staff could surface concerns without passing through the same layer of management that had historically managed those concerns into silence. She was not a different person. She was a harder version of the same person, pressing against her own habits with the slightly uncomfortable discipline of someone who has understood, at some cost, that not every room in which she sits is accurately described by the information she was given before she entered it. She made mistakes. She caught some herself and was corrected on others, and she had learned to treat correction as data rather than accusation. It was not grace. It was effort, and she was honest enough not to misrepresent the difference. On an evening in late November, when the first light snow of a new season was falling in slow, soft layers over Belhaven, Vivian brought Atlas to the shop with food from a restaurant she had learned Caleb liked, because she had wanted an excuse and was still learning that she did not need one. She stayed until the light outside had gone fully dark, and when Caleb walked her to the door and looked at the car idling at the edge of the lot, and she asked, half an offer, half a quiet test of who they had each become. Whether he wanted a ride home, he looked at the car and looked at her and said, quietly, "I'll walk." She did not take it as a refusal this time. She handed Atlas's leash to the driver, who understood without being told. And she fell into step beside Caleb on the snow-covered road where he had first turned his back on her. The dog ranging ahead of them between the tire tracks, and the lights of Belhaven coming on one by one through the trees. She said nothing and he said nothing, and the snow came down around them with the indifferent patience it had always had. And for once no one was walking away from anything. A year before, Caleb Rowan had walked 2 miles through that same storm because he would not accept pity from the hand that had broken him. Tonight, Vivian Ashcroft walked beside him through the same snow because she had finally understood that there are people who cannot be bought and cannot be dismissed and cannot be maneuvered into gratitude, people who can only be met, honestly and on foot, through the cold and the quiet, or not at all.